Hey, everybody, welcome to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. I've got Dr. Chad Van Dixhoorn with us today, and we're talking about the Puritan, the Westminster Divine, John Arrowsmith. It's going to be an exciting program. You guys stay tuned. You are watching The Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Rowntree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you. Hello, all. We are continuing to break outside of those theological echo chambers. We're talking about some Puritanism. It's one of those areas we haven't really scratched enough of the surface when it comes to Puritan writers. And there's really a resurgence of Puritan history right now as people are going back and learning from, what has made us in the West in our expression of Christian orthodoxy and how that's fleshed out here in the West. And this resurgence of history has been really spearheaded by guys like Dr. Chad Van Dixhoorn. And that's why we've invited him on today to talk about John Arrowsmith. But before we dive into the subject, I want to remind you that Remnant Radio is entirely crowdfunded. If you want to support the channel, there's a couple ways that you can give. Down in the links to the description, you can give a one-time gift on PayPal or a reoccurring gift on Patreon. If you choose to give on Patreon, you get access to a little bit of extra content. Sometimes you do live Q&As, book clubs, those kinds of things over there, extended interviews, so forth and so on. Without further ado, I want to introduce you to my partner in crime. That's Michael Rowntree. He's not much to look at, but he's a cool guy. I like him. Michael, how are you over there in Oklahoma?
Oh, that's a little rough, man. Doing good over here in Oklahoma. Actually, just got back to Oklahoma. Went hunting in Texas last weekend and got back Sunday night. So I had a good time. It was my first Sunday off as senior pastor at Bridgeway. So the church is still okay, still going strong, Josh. So fortunately, it doesn't depend on me. It depends on Jesus.
Wow. That is a solid takeaway from your hunting trip this week, Michael. Without further ado, Dr. Van Dixhoorn, tell us a little about yourself, and I'll Chad you from the rest of the show because that is your name. Some people think Chad is also anyway, neither here nor there. Anyway, tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry for those who are not familiar.
Yeah, so I'm currently serving as a professor of church history at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. I've been a pastor in Virginia, and I've served as a seminary professor at Reformed Theological Seminary there, and I've also served as a minister in Cambridge, UK, which I did when I was near the end of my time working in the history faculty there. I have a wife, Emily, 5 kids, and one's left in the house.
Excellent. So can you start off, and before we even talk about John Arrowsmith, people in our audience, again, are not super familiar with the Puritans. They're not going to be super, familiar with what a Westminster Divine is. Can you maybe unpack some of that vocabulary before we dive into our subject today? Yeah,
sure. So Puritans are people who wanted to see more reform in the Church of England in particular. So we get our first glimpse of a Puritan when Edward VI is on his throne at the middle of the 16th century, so the middle of the 1500s. He's told he needs to dress up like a bishop if he's going to serve in a ruling capacity in the church. He doesn't want to wear these massively expensive outfits. He's got other issues as well. They put him in jail. He changes his mind. It takes the fancy robes out of the closet, probably never wears them again. They come back again during the time of Queen Elizabeth, the second half of the 16th century, second half of the 1500s. And they're concerned that the worship of the church feels a little bit like people are making it up as they go along, that the Queen or her bishops are just kind of allowed to eclectically pick things that they like from the broader Western Christian tradition, get rid of other things. And they're saying, no, actually, the best way to worship, the only way to worship, is by listening to what God has to say. What's he want us to do? That's what's safe. It's not right to call people to do things use the sign of the cross at baptism, bow at the name, bow to the communion table, call the communion table an altar, make people do those sorts of things. They just say that's a problem. That's going to cut in on people's liberty of conscience, and it's beyond what Scripture calls us to do. So, and then they keep going. They say, we actually the problem is not just worship. We also have a problem with church government. It should not be hierarchical. There ought to be a plurality and a parity amongst elders who are ruling local congregations, and they need to be connectional. So you get these basic ideas: worship, government, and more. And then they also care a lot about godliness. So it's not enough just to try and reform the church. They really want to see people see themselves not just as sinners, but as people who are learning how to be saints. And that's a call for everybody. Okay. Westminster Divines, your next question. A divine is basically a Latin way of saying theologian. So deus, God, divine, instead of using the Greek word theos, or leading to the word theologian. So Westminster Divines doesn't mean we think they're gods. And in fact, we very much see their humanity as we watch them write and talk.
Amen.
Okay. So why is this guy so little known to us today? And why do you feel like he should be more known to us?
Yeah, so the very thing that made people well known in the 17th century sometimes makes them unknown in our century. If you're really a great writer, you've got big ideas. What are you going to do? You're going to write them in Latin. If you write them in Latin, scholars all around the world can read it. Most people who have gone to school have a grasp of Latin. Latin's the language of literate discourse. The problem, of course, is once Latin fades, we've got people's best works written in the wrong language. So the Puritans we know best, men like John Owen or Thomas Goodwin and others, Richard Baxter, they wrote a lot of stuff in English. John Arrowsmith's kind of big pieces in Latin. I guess the other thing is he's a kind of a team player. He does a lot of his work cooperatively with others. So if you kind of got like a heretics heroes version of history where you're only kind of looking for big people in history, a lot of the people who have a lot of influence are people who are working cooperatively with others. He was kind of a leader among men at a thing called the Westminster Assembly. Okay.
Would you say that the Westminster Assembly was the number one reason we should know him? What was like this?
Yeah.
Okay. So you say yes. Maybe just expand on that. Talk to us a little bit about the Westminster Assembly and his contribution to it.
That was like one of these friendly mid-sentence yeahs that means like, yeah, I'm tracking, I'm listening. But I think I can run through that.
Okay.
So the Westminster Assembly made a lot of people famous. Their being there gave them a reputation. Some people had a reputation already. John Arrowsmith is somebody, he's a bit of a combination. So he's at the Westminster Assembly. That's where he does some really important work. He's probably more famous, though, because of his Cambridge connections. He served as the leader of more than one really important Cambridge college at Cambridge University. And he writes this kind of incredible book. And he's a great people person. So he's a good networker. People really like him. And he can kind of get on with people from a variety of perspectives. Even though he's got clear commitments, he'll argue for them. He's an easy guy to like.
Okay.
Speak to us a little bit about that ecumenical line, because, as I've listened to you lecture about John Arrowsmith, it seems as if this guy is very ecumenical. He's willing to work with people. Like you said, he's a leader amongst the community. But in the same respect, he's also saying, hey, these are the bad guys, and starts naming and identifying and drawing a line in the sand. Where was that line for him? How did he determine what was going to be the dangerous doctrines versus what's going to be the orthodox stuff that he's gonna rally with?
Yeah. So great question. Ecumenical is a slippery word. You've only got one church in England, so you can't really be ecumenical.
Good point.
But he does want to say that, and he doesn't just want to say, he says that the Reformed understanding of the gospel and of the Word of God is the best and most faithful explanation of the Word of God. He's going to care about people who differ from him, depending on kind of the magnitude or the issue at stake. So congregationalists have a different form of government. He's not particularly worried about them. Socinians have a different view of God, very worried about them. The book that probably caught your attention, and which we'll probably get to at some point, deals right out of the gate with Socinians, people who deny that Jesus is God, people who deny that really Jesus is a main part of the Bible,
Wow.
who are really much more interested in kind of the moral life, and the simpler the Bible explanation, the simpler the explanation of the Bible, the more likely it is to be true, and so on. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Talk to us more about this heretical sect. Was this the number one heretical sect he was dealing with? Were there more? I know that he expends some energy battling heretics. If you could talk to us a little more about this.
Yeah. So Arrowsmith writes a book on spiritual warfare. It comes, I think, a couple years before the most famous of all Puritan books on spiritual warfare. It's the book, the blockbuster that comes later, written in English, is by William Gurnall, called "The Christian in Complete Armor." It's a study of Ephesians chapter 6, what it means to kind of put on the armor of God. And the fight is principally a fight for godliness. Arrowsmith cares about godliness, but in his book, which we're translating as Plans for Holy War, he looks at Ephesians 6 and says, you know what? The devil's starting point, the victory he most wants to win, is theological. It's doctrinal. The thing he most wants to do, and which will kind of give him the most mileage, is to confuse us in our thinking about God, the Bible, the gospel. So John Arrowsmith goes hard after the group called the Socinians. The Socinians would probably be the leading contenders for the most problematic theologians of the 17th century. They deny all kinds of key doctrines, and they deny a proper understanding of the atonement. They have a far too optimistic view of humanity and what we're capable of, and again, they've got the wrong view of God, which mattered a lot in the 17th century.
So tell us about this book that he wrote, not Principles for War, Plans for Holy War. Kind of explain to us, why this book, and I think that you said he's actually written a couple of books, but this one kind of stands above the rest in that regard.
Yeah. So he wrote some biblical commentaries that got sent to the printer and lost. So that's too bad. As a book on.
Hey, Michael, you should go ahead and back up the copy of the book that you're working on, just in case they lose your copy, like they did with this guy.
I'll get on that.
Yeah. Good advice. Or just sort of.
By the way, is that a book manuscript behind you on your wall?
There's like 30 people who've asked. I have to know what that is. I'm sorry, we're ADD-ing right now. Yeah, that right there.
It looks like maybe class attendance or something. Maybe a syllabus.
So this is a book I'm writing. It's got
yes, I was right. It was a book,
and it's actually on the Westminster Assembly, this gathering that I've studied for far too long.
Nice.
And I want to make sure that each chapter discusses certain like really key things, including different documents written by the Westminster Assembly. They wrote about 140. So I need to decide, well, which chapter is going to have which document. So this is just kind of my little go-to list over the shoulder, make sure I've got everything in each chapter. I've got other lists for other things in the chapters and so on. So
okay. I apologize for the ADD rant just now with me roasting Michael and talking about the sign on the back. Okay, back to Holy War. Give us an update on that.
Yeah, so John Arrowsmith is dying. He's sick, mid 1650s. His wife's expecting a child. It's a bummer. He is charged as the vice chancellor of the university. He's a big deal. He's gonna kind of come to the graduation ceremonies. Every year they have debates at these ceremonies as part of the entertainment for alumni. You can imagine how many more seminaries would have more alumni come back if they had debates. Um, and he's supposed to give speeches. He's supposed to manage things. He can't really do it. He's getting sick. So, so part of the book, the first part of the book are these lectures that he maybe gave, and they get like shorter and shorter and shorter, I think, as he runs out of energy. But he also has, and this is the main part of the book, he's got this plan for giving doctrinal lectures, sort of biblical and doctrinal lectures at his college. He can't do that either. So he says, look, I'll just write a book. And he wanted to give these lectures because he'd been thinking about something new. He said, this Genesis 3:15, the serpent getting his head crushed by the seed of Eve. He's like, I think I really, like, I'm at the end of my life. I really know what this is about. I want to give lectures on it. Too sick to give the lectures, so he writes this book. It's an unbelievable book in terms of its scholarship. I mean, I think he cites, I don't know, like 600 or 700 different scholars. And he's sick. He's not doing well. And he's, if you're really sick, you can imagine kind of editing a book that you're trying to finish. Maybe you could offer lectures where you're dealing with like different discrete topics, but he's kind of building this whole huge idea about spiritual warfare, this way in which the whole Bible ought to be read, and so on. It's an incredibly creative book. Again, I think that's kind of amazing. If I'm sick, I can imagine writing about sickness or dying or suffering or something like that. But this major study, and it's a couple 100,000 words long. So yeah, it's impressive.
Okay. All right. So it's rooted in Genesis 3:15. The seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. Is this foundation for holy war? And then he focuses a lot on holy war as being especially centered on doctrine, because you made the point that in his belief, Satan thinks I can get the most mileage out of it if I can convince people to believe the wrong things about Jesus and the gospel. And so, okay, for you personally, even devotionally, what are some of the most impactful observations that come from that book for you?
Yeah, so the first third of the book is heavily polemical, not a lot of devotional impact for me. It's about Genesis 3:15, how people are getting it wrong. The most edifying discussion here is what it means to be part of Christ's army, and how to think through Satan's temptation. So it's not free of edification, but compared to the second part, which goes through the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. The first part's more polemical. The second part is more practical. And he begins to think, what's it mean as a Christian? And he's especially thinking about Christian pastors, although there's relevance for others. What's it mean as a Christian pastor or a theologian to put on the breastplate of righteousness? What's it mean to use the sword of the Spirit, and so on? And this is practical, it's moving. He loves to tell little stories. It's really worthy of reflection. The last part's on prayer, and that's deeply moving. Here's a dying man writing about a life of prayer. He's known to have been a very pious, godly man, and just really useful reflections on a life of prayer.
Yeah, did he inspire was it William? Yeah, William Gurnall, who wrote the Christian's Complete Armor. I know that book is, some people remember that book inspired Spurgeon. I think it was one of Spurgeon's favorite books, if I recall correctly. We ended up getting a really old copy of it, like a 200-year-old copy that was like rebound and stuff. And of all people, we gave it to Todd White when Todd White came on the show, because he had said just recently that he had liked Spurgeon. So we're like, hey, this is one of Spurgeon's favorite books. Check this out. Anyway, so did he, Arrowsmith, inspire Gurnall in writing, and I don't even know if I'm saying his name right, in the Christian's Complete Armor? Is there any overlap there?
No, I don't think so, really. Their approaches are just so different. And before Gurnall gets to publish it, he preaches through this material. I mean, it takes him forever. He's well on his way when Arrowsmith's book hits the press. And it's not like William Gurnall makes a real sharp shift once Arrowsmith's book comes off the press. It's not like he says, "Oh my goodness, I've done it all wrong. Let's kind of take a new angle on holy war." Yeah.
So tell us about the people that you mentioned this already, a few of the people that he specifically targeted. You mentioned in one of your lectures, I felt like you mentioned Armenians and another group of people. Is it like Ligarians? Am I pronouncing that correct?
Yes. So of course, any Reformed theologian worth his salt in the 17th century and arguably beyond knows what Arminianism is and is very worried about it. Arrowsmith's no exception. Although Socinians are kind of the ones most frequently in his sights and the ones, he kind of deploys the biggest weapons for them. He's concerned that, yes, Arminianism places an emphasis on the will of man over the will of God. He believes that Arminianism is the stepchild of, or stepchild is a relation of Socinianism in the way in which it limits the power of God, and so on. But Arrowsmith is one of the first to blow the whistle on Wegelians, and no one's heard of Wegelians before. The guy.
I feel better now.
Yeah, right.
I couldn't even spell it. I was like trying to research it online. Like what is a Wegelian? Like,
yeah. So it's just the Weigei.
Okay.
No, sorry. Weigelians. See, I can't spell it either.
I was trying to spell it with an L, like Legalians. It's with a W. That's wild. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So throw in a W and you're set. So these people, this guy Weigel is and actually since he's German, we should all probably say Weigel rather than Weigel. So Weigel with a W is a German 16th century. No one suspects he's got weird theology. 20 years after his death, people begin reading his manuscripts and they say, instead of, "Oh my, this is dreadful, we should have a campfire," they say, "Oh, this is exciting, and we should publish it." I think exciting theology is often problematic. And so this whole movement starts. The Weigelians, to the horror of 17th century theologians, do not believe that the state should be supporting theological education. That's just a dreadful thought for a 17th century theologian. But much more than that, they also do not think that the civil magistrate should reform the church, no matter how bad the church is. Again, horrifying thought for a 17th century theologian. But they also hold to views that would be similar to the Quakers. So a de-emphasis on the importance of scriptures, a de-emphasis on education generally, a messed up understanding of the atonement, and kind of the list goes on. So there's some serious doctrinal issues, as well as these two kind of unconventional ideas, which Arrowsmith really goes after. Modern readers probably won't have a lot of sympathy with Arrowsmith here, but for him, it's pretty obviously one part of a bad package.
Now, there's certainly a lot of people here listening. They're going, okay, Armenians are put into the categories of these two other heretical groups. I've got to ask, are the Armenians today equally representative of the Armenians then? I mean, our audience is going to know what an Armenian is for the most part.
Yeah,
both the country and the theological position. But can you tell us a little bit about is there any difference between the present day theological group of Armenians versus those then?
Yes. So the answer is yes. I mean, the number of sort of classical Armenians who hold to the historic understanding of the ordering of the decrees and who hold to a kind of revised sort of covenant theology. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a lot of hardcore descendants of Arminius.
Mm-hmm.
Arminius has a kind of a philosophical background that's not easily replicated in the modern world.
Mhm.
But in terms of the Arminian emphasis on the freedom of our will, in terms of the emphasis on there's a higher degree of kind of optimism about human beings' ability to turn to God, less emphasis on our dependence on God, and there'll be a lot of Arminians who also like a large group of Arminius' followers will not be confident about assurance of salvation for Christians. They're going to want to
Mm-hmm.
qualify that or deny that. So there's continuity there. And then there's people who are worse than Arminius, for whom Arminianism might be a good category, but um, but but their manner of preaching, their manner of calling people to faith is significantly more manipulative than anything Arminius could have ever dreamed of. Kind of
Right.
contests for the
So
number of people who get saved, any kinds of sort of exciting ways to kind of manipulate people into a special prayer. Arminius didn't do that kind of thing, and he would probably be horrified.
right. So if Arrowsmith was against Arminius and put him like borderline, like at least like a cousin to some of these heretical groups,
Yeah,
he would have despised modern Arminians, I would guess. Is that correct?
yeah.
I mean, maybe not like despised as people, like I hate their soul,
Right. Yes.
but like their
Yeah,
belief system.
yeah. He'd be horrified with ministries of manipulation, basically. Um,
But you're not
uh,
suggesting that all Arminians today are manipulating people. You're just saying that
no,
particular branch.
I'm saying that there's a brand or a stream within Arminianism that's very manipulative.
Oh, we would
Right.
see that too. Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so he'd be most alarmed by that, but he'd be alarmed by all.
Yeah, Josh and I have this sensitivity for the sake of our guests. If anything can be soundbited and misportrayed, we jump in and try
That's
to
fine.
make sure we get that clarification.
Yeah,
That's all I
this
was
is
doing.
the internet where people are not always super charitable, you know. So we gotta ask the questions twice just in case people misheard what you said.
Yeah,
But maybe we can come back to the government piece, because that's a part that, like, for most of us who live in Western democracies, that's just a weird idea. For us, it's separation of church and state is in the Bible, right? and
Yeah.
and then to even think about Church of England, and especially just the expressions of that in the 17th century,
Yeah.
It's hard to even wrap our mind around. And then that someone would be holding up John Arrowsmith, who is like a hero in the faith, and then like in the next breath, is he like wanting the government to kill heretics? So it starts to get a little awkward. So is that what he wanted? And what do we do with that?
Yeah, so he doesn't want governments to kill heretics.
Okay. We just got a little more comfortable.
Yeah, but don't get too comfortable.
Okay.
I mean, most Christians since Constantine think that heresy has to be stopped one way or another. Some of them are willing to use the sword. Some of them are willing to use the sword metaphorically, by which they just mean the power of the civil magistrate. So you can believe what you want in the 17th century, but a lot of Puritans, in fact, almost everybody except Quakers and some Baptists, almost everybody believes that while you can believe what you want, you shouldn't be able to teach what you want or write what you want. And their basic, one of their important premises is that you can't have order in society unless there's unity and uniformity in religion, both of those things. So they see it as really a step towards war and social disintegration to allow people to teach whatever they want. And they have lots of proof of that, right? There's lots of wars over religion. And as they see it, if people had just believed the same thing, in a given area, there would have been less fighting. Now, it turns out later that people discover, well, actually, you can also just give freedom of religion. If a lot of your audience is American, there's a book about the disestablishment of religion in American states. Everywhere it's slower than it was in the nation as a whole. So once America becomes a nation, there's still lots of states that have a state religion. And it just takes decades and longer for those states to give that up. That's the norm. Now, I think it's a mistake. And the Westminster Confession of Faith actually got revised at the same time that America's Constitution was written. Just down the street, same town, they revised the Westminster Confession of Faith on just this issue. And so here's how I'd put it. The church today is the continuation of Israel of old. The faithful today are children of Abraham. So we are Israel. But the key question to ask, and this question wasn't always asked, is Israel when or Israel where? So are we Israel in the promised land? If that's what the church is, then a lot of those laws from the Mosaic economy, the Mosaic period, and the idea that magistrates should be involved in reforming the church, like Josiah and Ezra, or not Ezra, Josiah and Nehemiah and Hezekiah and so on, David, those become a model for us if we think of Israel in the promised land. But if we remember that we're actually Israel, as Hebrews puts it, in the wilderness. Just look at the examples in Hebrews. We're Israel in the wilderness. Or 1 Peter, we are Israel in exile. If we think of ourselves as exiles, people in the wilderness, then we're not going to come up with an understanding of church-state relations that has us imposing Christianity on others, imposing penalties on heretics, people from other religions, and so on. So we're Israel, but Israel when or Israel where? That's the key question. The Westminster Divines asked bucket loads of key questions and came up with the right answer. Here's one where they just weren't able to escape their own context.
That's interesting. Yeah, tell me a little bit about, you used the word heretics a couple times in our talk, and it's a real broad word, and throughout history often means just error, right? When you're using this as it relates to the Puritans, is it as myopic as to say heresy is a damnable offense that will get you thrown to hell, or does it just mean error that will affect the body of Christ in a mega negative way?
Yeah, another great question. So as they're thinking about it, heresy is like denying the Trinity, saying I'm Jesus, stuff like that. I have a T-shirt and a mug with a saying from one of the members of the Westminster Assembly that says a man can hold an error and not be a heretic. Arminians, no one was thinking that Arminians should be put in jail or silenced. It's an unfortunate disagreement, and some people will call them heretics. Other people will say it's an error. It's also really important to make a distinction between someone's views and the logical consequences of those views. So Charles Hodge, a 19th century Presbyterian, really articulates this well. And it's just so important to do. We often think about people's theology in terms of pure systems. As a pure system, I'm pretty alarmed about Arminianism. As practiced, most people deny the worst presuppositions that could account for the theology. Most people deny the worst conclusions that it could head to. Most people function very much like Calvinists, praying for the relatives to be saved.
Right.
And not most people, all Christians. And so I don't want to hold someone accountable for a logical conclusion which they deny. That's the key.
Yeah. What are some of the presuppositions and conclusions of Arminianism that you would be concerned about if there was a logical consistency in your mind between presupposition that leads to Arminianism and conclusion drawn from Arminianism? Because what I hear you saying is that the average Arminian on the street isn't really thinking about either these on one side or on the other, presuppositions or conclusions. But what I hear you saying, I think, is if you do draw those conclusions and if you do base it on those presuppositions, then you would say, I think it actually is alarming. So maybe you could help us understand from your perspective, and to all of our Arminian viewers, where this is breaking outside of our echo chambers is what we say here at Remnant Radio. So hear this as from a Christian brother who's sharing his convictions. So I invite you to do so.
And it's important that people who are absolutely new to our show is Michael would find himself in the Calvinistic camp. Chad Van Dixhoorn would be in a more Reformed camp, and I want to speak for you here. You can correct me if I'm wrong there. Reformed meaning that it's more than just Calvinism. It's more than just soteriology. It branches into eschatology and church governance, and it's a much broader category. I would find myself not in quite an Arminian and not quite Calvin. Like, I actually like Lutheran soteriology a lot, which Chad would say is going to be an inconsistent soteriological system.
Except on baptism.
Except on baptism, right? So granted, when I look at the Lutheran system of soteriology, I go, there is mystery in that for me that I can embrace and go, I just don't know. Anyway, neither here nor there. Chad, you wanna hop in there?
Chad, all of that so that you can just convince Josh that he needs to have like a definitive conviction on this.
I want our viewers to know there's a wide range of soteriological positions represented right here. Anyway, all that to say that, give us, answer Michael's question there on the presuppositions versus, what was the outflow of that?
Presuppositions and conclusions associated with Arminianism that would be alarming to you as a Reformed person.
Yeah.
Boy, there's a lot of different places this conversation could go, and I'm delighted to be thinking aloud with you here. I need a chalkboard. I'm a teacher, but I'll try one. I'll try going without this. Let me pick justification. There is historically an Arminian perspective on justification. So I'm going to deal with 17th century Arminians in particular. And, this might not work for you, but we'll give it a shot. So in the Reformed world around 1600, there's increasing clarity on what justification means and on the grounds or the basis for justification. And so the way in which the grounds of justification are understood in terms of covenant. God makes a covenant with Adam at the moment that he creates him, called a covenant of life, covenant of works, first covenant, Adamic, call it what you want. There's a covenant. And Adam's supposed to obey the terms of that covenant, and it's probationary. God has planned for Adam, should he obey, a promise of God not just walking with Adam in the garden, but Adam dwelling with God forever in perfect, rich, intimate communion. Adam chooses otherwise, right? Eats of the tree, falls into sin. Everyone else falls with him. What's next? So far, Arminians and Calvinists are on the same page here in the 17th century. What's next? The Calvinists will say God's standards don't change. That standard given to Adam remains, which is why Adam's in so very much trouble. Good news, covenant of grace. Jesus will come. He will do everything that the first Adam failed to do. He will keep the covenant of works himself. Not only that, he'll take all the penalties that Adam deserves. And so when Christ comes, he lives a perfect life, not just to qualify him to be a sacrifice, but he does everything for us and in our place. And when, by God's grace, he brings us to faith in Christ, we are justified. And justification is an umbrella term for two benefits. The forgiveness of sins, because the penalties are paid for, and the imputation of Christ's righteousness.
Amen.
Christ's righteousness is credited to us. So it's an umbrella term for two different benefits, tracking with the two things that Christ does for us. There's more that Christ does, but I'm just focusing on this. Now, what does the Arminian say in the 17th century? The Arminian says, dear me, same problem. Adam didn't keep the covenant of works. What God does is he offers a new covenant. It's gracious. The terms of the covenant are this, that instead of works, we need to believe. God accepts faith instead of works. What are the implications of that? Well, first of all, you're going to view the accomplishment of Christ's redemption differently. All the focus is on Christ paying the penalty. Christ's obedience matters, but it matters just to qualify him as a perfect sacrifice. It's not in our place. It's not everything is, he's not obeying in our place on our behalf.
So in a recapitulatory way, he's reliving Adam, but not in a substitutionary way for us.
Correct. Now, in the Reformed mind, that's really kind of gutting part of the atonement, part of the work of Christ. Secondly, the act of replacing the works condition, the law keeping holiness condition of the covenant of works with our faith as a new kind of easier condition. They think that, well, and I think that when you're doing that to faith, what you're essentially doing is making faith into this tiny, tiny little contribution on our behalf. Because that faith is now in place of our obedience. Richard Baxter, who is a Puritan Arminian, says it's just it's like a grain of mustard seed. It's the tiniest little contribution. Barely even counts. Reformed people say, we can't have any contribution. Faith is simply looking to Christ and seeing he's done it all. It's not our fulfilling of a modified covenant of works. So going to justification is one example. To me, those are kind of substantive issues, even if it's not normally what we're thinking about with justification. But when you have a sincere believer saying justification is just as if you never sinned, and they're thinking about forgiveness only, they're robbing us unintentionally of just the riches of Christ's atoning work. There's so much more. Christ is, once you begin to understand the substitutionary significance of Christ's life, you understand that, wait a minute, when we're fools, he is our wisdom. When we are weak, he's our strength. It's not just that he's our righteousness. He's everything, because we need so much more than forgiveness. He's our dignity when we're when we're living shamefully. He's everything that we need. And so that rich understanding of Christ living a substitutionary life, an act of obedience that doesn't just qualify him, but it's imputed to us. That's huge once you get it. It's rich and wonderful. You can preach this stuff.
Amen.
And I just don't want Christians to be robbed of that. And Arminians kind of played a place in setting us off on the wrong track with justification. So there's one example.
Yeah. Josh, what do you think of that?
I'd just be an inconsistent in soteriology if I was talking to Chad, because this weekend I preached on 3 of, I guess, the many Mosaic views of the atonement that I would hold, and I preached on recapitulation, Christus Victor, and penal substitution as the points of what took place at the cross. And recapitulation, looking at Adam and reinstilling a new and better humanity, looking at Christus Victor, even when things look like, the devil wins, we come out on top. And then even in penal substitution that he takes our place. And I think that there are Arminians out there who'd be listening to this that would be saying, hey, I'm penal substitution all the way. But I think what Chad's position is saying is that would be an inconsistent position, because faith then applies penal substitution rather than penal substitution accomplishing the actual justification, and that your faith is a byproduct of that atoning work, rather than faith being the appropriation of that work, that I'm appropriating that penal substitution to my life by the work of faith. And he's saying that am I hearing you correctly, that a person that says faith is the way that we appropriate penal substitution is robbing the efficacy of the atonement? Is that the way that you would articulate that?
So Josh, I was putting the accent on something else. I believe that Arminians place all the right weight on penal substitution. The question is, where does the life of Christ come in? Where does his obedience come in?
His active obedience,
really
yeah,
qualifying him to be a penal substitute. So it's not that this part's not, the atonement part's not about faith. That concern is really, what do we do with Christ's obedience? And then there is the second part that you were talking about. How do we think about faith? The Reformed take is, whatever faith is, it can never be defined as the fulfilling of a condition. It's just an instrument. And even when we say this, we're grasping for words, aren't we? Because what we really mean is, faith is recognizing that I'm giving up on me and looking entirely to Christ. And the way in which faith kind of functions in the Arminian application of redemption seems to give it a bit more muscle than that. More of a contribution, if you will. However small, however diminutive that may be, it's still my little part. There's God's part, there's my part. And so that's the second concern.
Okay. Well, I feel as though we should return to the subject matter we have designated for interviewing you about, which is the life and teaching of John Arrowsmith. So I'm going to come back to that. But, Josh and I, we like talking soteriology. So we appreciate the little rabbit trail here. Hopefully that was a blessing to our viewers. And one of the things I want to come back to is you were talking earlier about it's important that we ask ourselves the question is, like, Israel when? Israel in the promised land or Israel in the wilderness? Like, which one does the church most resemble? And your conclusion is we most resemble Israel in the wilderness. And if I understood you correctly, because this is really answering the question of government, the role of kind of theocratic laws of Israel and how they apply, should we be seeking to apply those and almost force people into subjection to Christian norms and so on. And I think what I understood you saying is, like, hey, if we are Israel in the promised land, they had a theocracy, but pre-promised land, when they're wandering in the wilderness, they didn't have it like a super established theocracy at that point. And what I understood you saying is, we can look at the teachings of the New Testament, and I'm kind of filling in some in between stuff here too, and reading between the lines. You can look at Hebrews, or you can look at Revelation, you can look at, Peter calling us exiles and so on. And you can say, we're really more like Israel in the wilderness, so we shouldn't be aiming for this sort of top-down force Christianity on others sort of thing. First of all, did I articulate what you were trying to say correctly? And then second of all, does that mean that you disagree with John Arrowsmith and his understanding of the matter?
Yeah. So first of all, theocratic Israel is not what John Arrowsmith is arguing for. The question is not what laws should be imposed, or do the laws in a Christian country mirror those in the Mosaic economy? He would not say that. What he is saying, that in a country with Christian leaders, Christian magistrates, we need to think of ourselves, and we need to think of the role of the magistrates as analogous to magistrates when Israel's in the Promised Land. So there's a really important distinction. I'm pretty sure I wasn't very clear about that earlier. So this is this is not theonomy. What laws do we obey? It's what's the job of the civil magistrate?
Okay.
Should we be thinking of ourselves as Christians in Babylon or Christians in Jerusalem? So it's an entirely separate discussion as to what do we do with Old Testament laws. Not ceremonial, that was easy. Moral, they continue. What do we do with the judicial laws? That's a separate question. And I think I'd be on Arrowsmith's side there in saying, Christians are to learn from the whole of the Old Testament, but we don't just take Israel's law code and plunk it into England, America, elsewhere. So then to your second question, am I disagreeing with John Arrowsmith? When especially, there's just points in his lectures. Remember those lectures that he gave at the university? And there's points in the book. These two are kind of glued together under one publication. There's points in which he complains about magistrates who are no longer willing to support good Christian education because they're not really worried about error like magistrates used to be, and magistrates are not kind of chasing down and punishing various errorists, heretics, and so on. He's writing this while Cromwell is the leader, and Cromwell was pretty big on Christian liberty and freedom of speech and so on. So this kind of alarms Arrowsmith, and he goes to London. His deputy leader in the college is probably a Quaker, and he just shouldn't be teaching people theology. But Arrowsmith really can't do anything more than just get him booted out of the university. He thinks, well, they're getting pretty wimpy in Parliament. I disagree with that. I think that's not the job of Parliament, because we are not we're not in the Promised Land. We're in exile, and what we do need to do, we need people to. We need to call them to what they know in their conscience to be true. I mean, people know not just who God is, but that we owe Him obedience. And so we need to call people to that. I'm concerned that I'm concerned that in America today and elsewhere in the world, there's always a sense in which we got to get to the gospel first. The gospel is what's important. Well, that's true. The gospel is important. We need to get to the gospel. But a lot of people aren't going to sense their need for the gospel as long as we are not confronting the degree to which they're wandering from God's law. So there's a place to be faithful to Christ in saying, actually, this new trend in society is deeply wrong. It's harmful. We need to fight
the bad news before the good news kind of deal.
Law, gospel,
or at least be giving them together. There's no reason to think that we're being more faithful to the Lord by focusing on the gospel. It's a more palatable message for us to focus on gospel. It's much harder for us to focus also on the law. John Arrowsmith would definitely say that, and there I would agree with him.
Yeah. That law gospel distinction, extremely important, and extremely important in our day with moral relativism just kind of coming on the rise. People not realizing, okay, this is a nice religion. This guy died on a cross, but I'm not Hitler, and their moral compass is based off of not being one of the worst men in human history. But instead saying, no, it's not the action of your sin as much as it is what is being sinned against. This perfect, holy, spotless God, you've erred on him. It's not measuring yourself compared to some horrible dictator. So I would just say yes and amen to law gospel distinctions. We got to wrap the show up because it's right at 5:00. So I would just ask, Dr. I'll call you Chad. Van Dixhoorn is a mouthful. So Chad, tell us a little bit, where do we keep reading on John Arrowsmith or just the Puritans in general? Where do we go to continue this reading? One of the things that I think is extremely important, there are people in the comment section right now that are like, hey man, like really anti-Calvinism. That's really popular right now. But the reality is that Reformed theology has given some of the greatest contributions to just evangelicalism in general. And I would say that going back to that source material, you can pull out nuggets, even if you disagree with some of the tenets. And I have found personally, again, that law gospel distinction, the Lutheran and Reformed traditions have brought in certain life messages alive in me from going back to those sources. So first of all, I want to encourage you guys to go back and read those sources, but then I want to ask, Chad, where do we find those sources?
Yeah, so thank you. Well, first of all, with Arrowsmith, I write an introduction to a translation by Dr. David Noe. David Noe translates this work. It's amazing. It's an amazing translation. And Reformation Heritage Books, I think, will be publishing it next year. So that's Arrowsmith. A great place to get works by Puritans is Banner of Truth, Banner of Truth Trust. They have a conference that's free to seminary students and needy ministers. They have a couple of them every year. They're just really wonderful. Lots of good, edifying preaching. Fantastic stuff. The most historians have argued that the most influential text in the first 3 centuries of American history is the Westminster Confession of Faith, and paired with that, the Shorter Catechism. If you really kind of want to understand the history of this country and the shaping of religion to the mid-1800s, those are 2 texts you've just got to grab. You might not like them, but the Westminster Confession of Faith, available online, and the Westminster Shorter Catechism, these next to the Bible are the 2 most influential texts in American religious history.
Absolutely.
Just really
so good.
It's super important to read. I do have a guide to the Westminster Confession of Faith, kind of written for those who are not familiar with Calvinism. And I try and use the passages of the Bible that the Puritans themselves found helpful for explaining Reformed theology. It's a user-friendly, non-grumpy book.
Non-grumpy.
The nuts and bolts of the Reformed faith. So that's put out by Banner of Truth. It's called Confessing the Faith. So that's a kind of theological guide.
Banner of Truth puts out some really great content, guys. Y'all need to go over there and check out their stuff. They've got digital stuff. They've got printed stuff. It's a really great resource.
All kinds of good stuff.
One of the things that we really want to encourage people to do is to read broadly and think deeply about Christian theology. So we are going to have people that we like and people that we disagree with strongly. But regardless, we live in an age of confirmation bias, and we live in an age where we can literally raise up teachers for ourselves that tickle our ears. And I think we have to in this day be extremely intentional about exposing ourselves to the theological positions of people we disagree with. Because the Holy Spirit will lead us and guide us into truth if we're truly seeking truth, and if we're looking to men of God from days past, as God led them into truth, He can lead us into truth. And I think looking into those sources is a good and wise thing for all Christians to do. Michael, it sounded like you had something to jump in there.
Well, I think it's kind of along the lines of what you were saying, Josh, and it comes back to what Chad was saying. Chad, you made this statement kind of at the very beginning of the episode where it was something like exciting theology can be problematic.
Yeah.
And I like that statement because, so Josh and I are continuationists. We believe in all the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And we find that sometimes in our camp, this can happen in any camp, continuationist or otherwise. But I think in some ways, especially in the continuationist camp, there can be some prophetic person with some brand new take that no one's ever heard before, revelation of some new truth, and like, hey, we've got the apostles and the prophets now, and they're the foundation of the church, and we bring the new revelation about the way things are supposed to be done. And we get concerned about these seemingly new truths that get people worked up and get people excited and rah-rah and all that. And man, I don't want the new truths. I want the old truths. That's all we need is the old truths. What's in the book. And any sort of spontaneous revelation always submits to written revelation. And so when you talk about exciting theology can be problematic, I just, of course, there's a sense in which, like, I even heard you, Chad, getting excited talking about the atonement, which itself, it rubbed off on me and got me excited. I know what you meant by that. It wasn't like, hey, we should have dull, boring theology.
Yeah.
It was, what's the new hot button thing? And that's, I think, like, going back and reviewing some of these statements, like, even if you're not Reformed, go back and read. It's online everywhere. Westminster Confession of Faith. Just look it up. And man, it's there's so much articulation of so many theological issues that I just find it extremely helpful to go and just kind of get outside of my culture and time frame and just see what some old people were saying about God and the Bible. And of course, that was just a few hundred years ago. Read the church fathers too, read it all. But I find that so helpful as a protection against just getting too excited about the new and rather grounding ourselves in the old. So really appreciated the way you said that.
Oh, cool, guys. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Remnant Radio. Chad, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'd love to have you back. You're a wellspring of knowledge when it comes to the Puritans. So I'd love to pick your brain on some of that stuff and point people to some of your other writings. So guys, thank you so much for tuning into this program. If you enjoy it, there's a great way that you can support us. You can hit that subscribe button, punch that like button. We've got a bunch of you watching right now. And man, if you love what the channel produces, there are links in the description if you want to support. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. Some of you are going, hey, what the heck is happening on Tuesdays with Spooky Evangelism? I had this hard drive. Spooky Evangelism, if you guys don't know, is where we're teaching you apologetically how to engage with neo-pagans, Satanists, people who practice Wicca, like some of the more spooky stuff. We got tons of apologetics on Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, but like not on neo-paganism. So like, how do we engage with these people apologetically with the gospel? That content, oddly enough, was lost on a SanDisk, kind of like this. My computer won't read it, so I sent it off to a data recovery place. Hopefully we'll get those Tuesday episodes out maybe as soon as next week.
All that talk about backing up my book, dude.
I know. It's the Lord. It's at least it wasn't a she-bear that came out of the woods and beat me. Am I right? Okay. Guys, we'll see you next week. Blessings.